Salvete omnes. This is chapter 42, exercise A. Part 1 of exercise A goes from armo to recipio. Part 2 of exercise A is impedio to possum. That is the rest. We will begin with armo. Armo, armare, armavi, armatus. We are synopsizing this entire verb in Latin. That includes with the subjunctive, and the focus will be on the subjunctive mood. But we will begin with the indicative. So the present indicative, active and passive voice. We are to synopsize this verb in the first person singular. So I want the first person singular for all of these blanks. So armo, armare, armavi, armatus. You need to know the principal parts before you begin. If you don't know the principal parts, you are screwed before you even start. So indicative, present tense, active, first person singular, that's just the first principal part. The first principal part goes right here if the verb is first person singular, and that is armo, armo. I arm. I put armor on. The passive takes the first principal part, armo, but it adds the r, the r. So armo, r, armor. I am armed. I arm, active voice. I am armed. It's happening to me. I am the subject, first person singular. The action in the passive voice happens to me. All right, so for the imperfect and the future active and passive voices, this is a first conjugation verb, we need the present stem. The present stem of a first conjugation verb is found by taking the RE, chopping the RE off of the second principal part. So arma, arma is our present stem, and we need to write arma in the imperfect, future, active, and passive. We would put the present stem arma for the present tense as well if the verb were not first person singular. If the verb is first person singular, you need to start with the first principal part because that's his only job, is to be the first person singular present tense. For the imperfect active, we add the ba. Same thing with the passive. The ba is the tense marker for the imperfect tense. For the active voice, we need to add the personal endings. So we had the O up here. Here it's going to be MST muss tis und instead of OST muss tis und. The passive has the R, the R. Restur, mur, mini, untur. For the future, because this is a first conjugation, we are fine using bo, bis, bit, bimus, bitis, bunt for the future ending. So it's bo. Armabo, I will arm. And then the passive has the bo, but then adds the passive personal ending r. So armabor, armabor. Now for the completed action tenses, these, the present, imperfect, and future, are the progressive or continuous action tenses. That's why they use the present stem. For the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect, we're going to the third principal part and we're chopping off the I. But this is only for the active voice. We only use the perfect stem, third principal part minus the I, chop off the I, for the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect active voice. So arma all the way down here. Let's go ahead and add those personal endings to finish off these tenses before moving on to the passive voice. So the perfect tense endings are I isti it, imus istis erunt. We want the first person singular I, armavi. The pluperfect active, we're going to use the tense marker era, and then the personal ending like with the imperfect. So armaveram. Armaveram. And then the future perfect, that has the tense marker ere for most of its endings, for most of its forms, but the first person singular uses just the O. So it's almost like the future here. Bo, ero. So armavero, armavero. So armavi the perfect tense has two translations. I armed and I have armed, either the ed form of the verb in the past tense or the English third principal part with the helping verb has, have. Pluperfect translated had, I had armed, and the future perfect, I will have armed. And these are all active voice. Let's jump over to the passive. For the passive perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect, we go to the fourth principal part of the verb, armatus. Treat it like an adjective of the first and second declension, with us being the masculine. So armatus with armatus being the masculine, armata being the feminine, and armatum being the neuter. We are working with a first person singular, so we're using the singular nominative forms for the masculine, feminine, and neuter. If this verb were plural, these would have to be plural as well. Armati with an I for the nominative masculine plural, armatai, AE for the feminine nominative plural, and armata, a short A for the neuter nominative plural. But we are working with first person singular, so keep it singular. Armatus all the way down. Now we need a helping verb. We need a finite verb to help out this participle, this adjective. So perfect passive uses the present tense of sum esse fui futurus. So sum es est, sumus estis sunt. We want sum because this is first person singular. Armatus sum. So if masculine person is saying this, armatus sum. I have been armed. I, masculine person, was armed. If the speaker were feminine, armata sum, I, feminine singular speaker, was armed. I have been armed. And then a neuter speaker, armatum sum. The pluperfect uses the imperfect of sum as its helping verb. So eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratis, erant. We want eram. Armatus eram. The future perfect, armatus ero. We want the future of sum. Ero, eris, erit, erimus, eritis, erunt, with a UNT, erunt. So that's it for the indicative. For the subjunctive, remember the subjunctive lacks a future and future perfect, so we are only working with the present, the imperfect, the perfect, and the pluperfect. So for the present tense, we have a first conjugation verb. You go to the present stem, arma, found by chopping off the RE from the second principal part. You're going to change that final A, that vowel at the end of the present stem. Change that A to the letter E. So arma becomes arme, arme. Hey, that looks weird. Looks different from the indicative. Yes, because it's the subjunctive. So arme, both for the active and the passive. Now you just add the correct personal endings. For the active, we want the first person singular personal ending for the active, and that's M. MST musta sunt, so armem, armem. For the passive, arrestur, mormeniuntur, armer, armer. I may arm, or may not, I don't know. I may be armed, but it could also not happen. For the imperfect subjunctive, find the present active infinitive. It is the second principal part, unaltered, unchanged. Armare, first conjugation. Go ahead and write armare for both entries, and then add the personal ending. Easy. M for the active, R for the passive. Armarem, armarem, armarer, armarer. For the perfect and pluperfect active, we're going to be working with the perfect stem. Third principal part, chop off the I. So armav, armav. And then you add the endings for the perfect subjunctive. Erim, eris, erit, erimus, eritis, erent. They look a lot like the future perfect in most instances. So this is just erim, armaverem, armaverem. Then for the pluperfect active subjunctive, we want the verb's perfect active infinitive, the perfect active infinitive. You go to the verb's perfect stem, third principal part, chop off the I, add isse to get arma, we say, and then to make it a finite verb, give it a finis, an ending, which we want mst, muste sunt, because we're in the active voice. Armawisem. So the passive voice, for the passive voice, we want the fourth principal part. The passive voice for the subjunctive, it mirrors the indicative quite a bit. So we want the fourth principal part, armatus but instead of the indicative of sum as our helping verb, change the present indicative of sum to the present subjunctive of sum. So sim, armatus sim. For the pluperfect, armatus once again, only this time, instead of the present subjunctive of sum, we want the imperfect subjunctive of sum. Just like with the pluperfect indicative passive, we use the imperfect indicative of sum, that's eram. In the subjunctive, we're going to use the subjunctive version, which is essem, esses, esset, essemus, essetis, essent. So we have essem, armatus essem. So that's it for the indicative and the subjunctive. Make sure you study the subjunctive especially closely, because that's what this lesson is mostly focused on. Let us now move on to the participles, the infinitives, and the imperatives. For a more in-depth review of participles and infinitives, check out the participles and infinitives videos. So we have the same principal parts, armo, armare, armavi, armatus. We're still working with the first person singular, though that doesn't matter so much anymore. So participles, verbal adjectives, they are both verbs and adjectives. They're a mutant morphine of the two. So participles. Present active participle in Latin is the verb's present stem for a first conjugation like armo. Go to the second principal part, chop off the re, and you get arma. And then we're going to add ens for the nominative, singular, masculine, feminine, and neuter. And then entis for the genitive. So armans, armantis. Because participles are verbals, they come from verbs like armo, armare, armavi, armatus, and they are also adjectives, so they are declined like adjectives, like a third declension, one termination adjective, like diligens, diligentis, or potens, potentis, armans, armantis, armanti, armantem, armante, armantes, armantium, armantibus, armantes, armantibus. That's for the masculine feminine. For the neuter, they'll follow the neuter path. So armans, armantis, armanti, armans, armante, armantia, armantium, armantibus, armantia, armantibus. Make sure you review participles. There is no present passive participle in Latin. There is no perfect active participle in Latin. There is a perfect passive participle. It is the fourth principal part, armatus translated as having been verbed. Present active is verbing. So armans, armantis would be arming, ing, arming. For the passive, having been armed, having been armed. Remember that it will agree with the person who was armed in gender, number, and case because it's an adjective. It's a verbal adjective. The future active takes the fourth principal part but squeezes an like the word future. So we get armatur usa So armatus, and then you put a ur before the usa Armatur usa about to arm. And then the future passive participle is the same as the gerundive. It's the present stem arma plus endus So we get armandos, armanda, armandum. To be armed, must be armed, about to be armed. For the infinitive present active, that is the second principal part of the verb, unchanged, armare, armare. A first conjugation infinitive changes from the active to the passive by changing the final E to an I, armari, armari. The perfect active infinitive, as we have previously said, is found by going to the third principal part, chopping off the I and getting the perfect stem, armab, and then adding isse, armavisse, and that's it. It's also the base of the pluperfect subjunctive. If you add a personal ending to that perfect active infinitive, then it's no longer an infinitive. You've given it a finis, an ending, so it's a finite verb, and that would be the pluperfect subjunctive. Without the ending, it's an infinitive. It's infinite. The perfect passive, it's the fourth principal part. Just add an esse as a helping verb to make it an infinitive. Armatus aum esse. So armatus esse, armata esse, armatum esse. The future is like the future participle, armaturus, but add the esse to give us an infinitive. And in the future passive infinitive, it's the fourth principal part, but change that us to an It's always going to be never changes away from the So armatum, armatum. The helping verb is iri, the present passive infinitive of eo ire. Even the Romans used go for the future tense. I'm gonna head out. I'm going to. We use going for the future tense. Most languages tend towards that at some point, and Latin is no exception. Armatum iri. To arm, to be armed, to have been armed, to be about to arm, to be about to be armed. The imperative mood, the commands, imperative singular of armo, armare, it's just the present stem. Arma, you can put an exclamation point if you want. Arma, arm. The plural adds te, armate, armate. Feel free to add an exclamation point there. Armate, armate. The imperative singular passive is the same as the second principal part as the present active infinitive. Armare, be armed, get armed, suit up. And the imperative plural, it's the same as the second person plural present passive indicative. So the ending is mini, armamini, armamini. Optime, excellent. That's an exemplar of a first conjugation verb, first person singular of armo, armare, armavi, armatus. Let us move on. Now I'm just going to run through the rest of these just out loud. So terreo, terrere, terrui, territus, second person singular. This is a second conjugation verb. I can tell by the eo in the first principal part and the ere, that's a long e. Terrere, because it has the eo. Terreo, terrere, terrui, territus. We want the second person singular. So keep in mind, it's a second conjugation. That's important. So we want the present stem. The present stem is terre, terre. Write terre for the present, imperfect, and future, active, and passive. And then add the second person singular endings. So for the active, that's going to be an S, O-S-T, mustis und. For the passive, it's going to be ris, ar restur, mor mini untur. So we have terres for the present active, indicative, terres. Passive, terreris, terreris. Imperfect, terrebas, terrebas. Passive, terrebaris, terrebaris. The future will be terrebis, terrebis. The passive, terreberis, B-E-R-I-S, not B-I, B-E-R-I-S, terreberis. The perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect actives will be formed from the third principal part minus the I. That's the perfect stem teru, and then add the appropriate tense markers and personal endings. So the perfect active teruisti, teruisti, terueras, terueras, terueris, terueris. The passive for the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect will be formed from the verb's fourth principal part, territus. Make sure you treat it like an adjective with the first and second declension. Territus aum, and then add the appropriate helping verbs. Territus aum es, territus aum eras, territus aum eris. For the subjunctive, present subjunctive, this is a second conjugation, so the present stem is terre. Add the letter A, so we get terrea, and then the personal endings. So terreas, terreas, terrearis, terrearis. Imperfect, present active infinitive, terrere, and then add personal endings. Terreres, terreres, terrereris, terrereris. The perfect and the pluperfect are formed from the verb's perfect stem, teru, and then add the appropriate tense markers and endings. Terueris, terueris. Pluperfect, teruisse, and then add the personal ending s. Teruisses, teruisses. For the passive, territus aum, like an adjective, from the fourth principal part, just add the appropriate helping verbs. Territus aum sis, from sim, sis, sit, simus, situs, sint, the present active subjunctive of sum. And then the pluperfect, territus aum esses, esses, from the imperfect subjunctive of sum. Let's go to the participles. Terre is the present stem plus ens entis, terrens terrentis. No present passive, no perfect active. Territus aum for the perfect passive. Future active, territorus aum. And the future passive, terrendus aum, terrendus aum. Present active infinitive, terrere. The passive, terreri. The perfect active, terruisse. The passive, territus aum esse. The future active, territorus aum esse. And the future passive, territum iri, territum iri. Jump down to the bottom here for the imperatives. The imperative singular active is terre, terre. The imperative plural active is terrete, terrete. The imperative singular passive is terrere, terrere. And the imperative plural passive is terremini, terremini. Optime, moving on to duco, ducere, duxi, ductus, third person singular. Duco, as you can tell by its principal parts, this is a third conjugation verb. Duco, ducere, this is a short E as opposed to the second conjugation's long E. So the present stem of a third conjugation is found by removing the O from the first principal part. So the present stem is duc. Third conjugations tend to be consonant stems. Actually, they don't tend to be, they are consonant stems. Third declension nouns are also consonant stems. So the third, everything in Latin tends to be a consonant stem. So duke, D-U-C is going to be the present stem. So for the present active, we want the third person singular. So for the active, the personal endings are OST, musste sunt. We're going to be wanting a lot of T's. And then the passive, ar restur, mor mini untur. We want a lot of tours, T-U-R. So for the present active, it's duke, D-U-C, then add an I, and then a T, duket, duket. We had an I for most of the endings, duco, ducus, duket, ducimus, ducitus, but a U before the NT, ducunt, ducunt. So we have ducat here, D-U-C-I-T, ducat. Passive, ducitur, ducitur. Imperfect, duke, add the letter E, duque, and then add the ba, and then the personal endings. So ducebat and ducebatur. The future does not use bo bis bit. Third conjugation, third IO, and fourth conjugations do not use bo bis bit. They use es et, emus etis ent for the active, and ar eris etor, emor emini entor for the future passive. So future active is going to be duces, D-U-C-E-S. That is different from the present D-U-C-I-S. Ducis versus duces. Passive is going to be ducer. I'm sorry, we're in the third person singular. My bad. Ducat. Ducat. D-U-C-E-T. Ducat. As opposed to D-U-C-I-T for the present. My bad. Ducat and ducat. E-T. Got to pay attention to what person number you're in. So future passive. Ducatur. Ducatur. E-T-U-R. Ducatur. So the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect active will be formed from the third principal part minus the I. The nice thing about the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect, the completed action tenses, is that no matter what conjugation you're in, they're formed the exact same way. They're even formed the exact same way for irregular verbs. It's actually rather nice. So the perfect stem for this verb is dux, D-U-X. So dux, 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 add the endings. Duxit, duxerat, duxerit. For the passive, fourth principal part, ductus aum, we have singular person. So ductus aum est, ductus aum erat, ductus aum erit. For the present subjunctive, third conjugation, the stem is duc, add an A, so duca, and then add the personal ending ducat. Ducat. D-U-C-A-T. The present active indicative is D-U-C-I-T. The future is D-U-C-E-T. Present subjunctive D-U-C-A-T. Ducat. Passive is ducatur. Ducatur. The imperfect, ducere, add the T. Ducaret. Passive, ducaretur. The perfect is dux, and then add eret. Duxeret. The pluperfect is duxisse, and add the T. Duxisset. For the perfect passive, it's ductus aum sit. For the pluperfect passive, it's ductus aum esset. Participles. Present stem is duke. Add E. You got to add an E, letter E, N-S. And then for the genitive, E-N-T-I-S. So ducens, ducentis. No present passive, no perfect active. The perfect passive is ductus aum. The future active is ducturus aum. And the future passive, the gerundive, is ducendus aum. It's the present stem duc, then add an E, duque, and then the endus aum. Ducendus aum. Ducendus, ducenda, ducendum. The present active infinitive is ducere. Now, the present passive infinitive drops the entire ERE because the E is short and adds an I, so we get the, wait for it, dookie. That's right, I said dookie. That's awesome. The perfect active is dux, and then at isse, duxisse. The perfect passive is ductus esse. The future active is ducturus esse. And the future passive is ductum iri. Ductum iri. For the imperatives, duco is irregular. I chose it because it is one of the few irregular imperatives in Latin. You remember them. How could you forget dic, duc, fac, and fair? Dic from dico, duc from duco, fac from facio, and fair from ferro. How could you forget? So we have duc, D-U-C, duc. For the plural, it's ducite with an I-T-E. Got to add the I. Ducite. The plurals for the irregulars are dicite, ducite, facite, and ferte. No I in ferte. It's just fer and then te. So here we have duc and ducite for the imperatives of duco. Ordinarily, for a third conjugation, you would just chop off the RE from the second principal part, from the present active infinitive. For the passive, we have ducere. Imperative singular passive is ducere, second principal part. And then the plural is ducimini with an I. Ducimini. It's the same as the second plural present passive indicative. Ducimini. Optime. Moving on to recipio, recipere, recapi, recaptus. First person plural. This is a third IO. So it's a mix between the third and the fourth. So it has the IO that marks it as a third IO, but its infinitive looks like a third conjugation. So we have recipio, recipere, recapi, recaptus. Its present stem, like the third, is found by chopping the O off of the first principal part. So the present stem will end in an I, always, recipi. If you have a present stem and it does not end in an I, you do not have a third IO. It's a trick, get an X. All third IO's present stem must end in the letter I, recipi. So first person plural, recipimus, recipimus. Passive, recipimor, recipimor. For the imperfect, recipi, add the E, then the ba. So we get recipiebamus, recipiebamus. Passive, recipiebamor, recipiebamor. For the future, just like the third, we don't use bobis bit. We use ames et amus, a descent. So recipiemus, recipiemus. Present stem plus the ending. For the passive, ar eris etur, emor emini entur, recipiemur, recipiemur. For the perfect, pluperfect, future perfect, perfect stem, recep, add the endings. Recepimus, recepimus. Receperamus, receperamus. Receperimus, receperimus. The perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect passive comes from the fourth principal part, receptus. Make it like an adjective, receptus. Now we are dealing with a plural person. So make sure that the us becomes plural. Recepti, I, a. Recepti, recepti, recepta for the masculine, feminine, and neuter. So recepti, I, a, sumus. Recepti, I, a, eramus. Recepti, I, a, eremus. For the subjunctive, present active, we have the present stem recipi, add the A, the personal endings. Recipiamus, recipiamus. Passive is recipiamur, recipiamur. For the imperfect, reciperemus, receperemos. Passive, receperamur, receperamur. Perfect, recep, perfect stem, plus erimus, receperimus, receperimus. Pluperfect, recep, plus isse, and then mus, recepisemus, recepisemus. For the perfect passive, recepti a, make sure you make it plural, recepti a simus. And then for the pluperfect passive, recepti a essemus, recepti a essemus. Participle, recipi add the e, and then the ens entis. Recipiens, recipientis, recipiens, recipientis. No present passive, no perfect active, receptus a just the fourth principal part. The future active, recepturus a and then passive, recipi, and then add the e, and then endus a recipiendus a recipiendus a Present active infinitive, recepere. Passive, like the third conjugation, the entire ere drops out and is replaced by the letter I, recipi, recipi. Perfect active infinitive would be recepisse, recepisse. Perfect passive, receptus a esse. Future active, recepturus a esse. And the future passive, receptum iri, receptum iri. The imperative singular is going to be recipe, recipe. Chop the re off the second principal part, recipe. For the plural, it's recipite. That final e on the singular changes to an I, and then you add te. Recipite, recipite. The passive is going to be recepere, recepere. And the plural will be recipimini, recipimini. Optime, that is the end of the first part of exercise A. I'm going to keep going, but this is the end of the first part. Welcome back. This is the second part of exercise A. Wow, that was quite a long time that passed there. So, let's start with impedio, impedire, impedivi, impeditus, impeditus. This is a fourth conjugation. I can tell by the endings of the principal parts. Io, ire, and ire in the second principal part. And then e, and then us. So the present stem, like the third and third io, found by chopping the o off the first principal part, impedi, and then adding the proper endings. We want the second person plural. So a lot of tisses here. So ost must tis und. So we have impeditus, impeditus. For the passive, mini, arestor mor mini untor, impedimini, impedimini. For the imperfect, impedi, add the e, then the ba. Impediebatis, impediebatis. Passive, impediebamini, impediebamini. The future, like the third and third io, does not use bobis bit, but ames et amus etis and. So we want etis, impedietis, impedietis. And the passive uses ar eris etor, emor emini entor, impediamini, impediamini. The perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect form from the perfect stem of the verb, third principal part minus the I, impediv, impediv. So you add the endings, impedivistis, impedivistis, impediveratis, impediveratis. In the future perfect, impediveritis, impediveritis. Passives, fourth principal part, impeditus a but we're dealing with a plural person, so change it to plural, impediti, I, a. Impediti, impediti, impedita. So impediti, and impediti I, and then add estis. Sum ss, sumus estis sunt. Impediti I estis, impediti I eratis, impediti I eritis. For the subjunctive, present subjunctive, the present stem is impedi, add the a, impedia, and then add the personal endings. Impediatis, impediamini. Imperfect, impedire, and then add the tis and then the mini. Impediretis, impediremini. Perfect comes from the perfect stem impedib, plus the perfect subjunctive endings erim, eris, eret, erimus, eritis, erent. So impediveritis, impediveritis. The pluperfect, impedivisse, like the perfect active infinitive, this guy. Impedivisse, but you add the personal endings, tis, impedivissetis, impedivissetis. For the passive, the perfect passive, impeditus aum, but make it plural. Impediti I, and then situs, situs, sim, sis, sit, simus, situs, sint, the present subjunctive of sum, situs. And then we want the imperfect subjunctive of sum, essetis, as the helping verb for the pluperfect passive subjunctive. Impediti I, essetis. Participles. Impedi, add the e, and then ens entis. Impediens, impedientis. No present passive, no perfect active. Impeditus aum. Future is impediturus aum. Passive, impediendus aum. Impedi, present stem, plus the e, plus the endus aum. Impediendus aum. Present active infinitive is impedire. For the passive, like the first and second conjugations, the final e changes to an I. Impediri, impediri. Perfect active, perfect stem, impedib, add isse, impedivisse. It's the base of the pluperfect subjunctive in the active. Impedivisse. Passive, impeditus aum esse. Future, impediturus aum esse. And the future passive, impeditum iri. For the imperative singular active, impedi, impedi. Second principal part, chop off the re, impedi. For the plural, add te, impedite, impedite. For the imperative singular passive, impedire, impedire. And for the imperative plural passive, it's the same as the present passive up here, because it's the second plural present passive indicative. So impedimini, impedimini. Optime, that takes us through the first, second, third IO, and fourth conjugations. Now let's take a look at dun dun dun, sum, esse fui futurus. So sum, go ahead, cross out the passive voice. There's no passive voice for sum. Sum is the verb that we use to make other verbs passive. It in itself has no passive. How is that possible? So let's walk through the third person plural of sum. Remember, sum is irregular in the present, imperfect, and future. It's totally regular in the perfect stem tenses, because as long as you know that the principal parts are sum, esse, fui, futurus, and fu is the perfect stem, everything else is totally normal. So the present active is sunt, sum es est, sumus estis sunt. Imperfect, eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratis, erant, erant. The future, ero, eris, eret, erimus, eritis, erunt, erunt is the third plural. Perfect stem is fu, I pity him. fuerunt, fuerunt, fuerant, fuerant, fuerent, fuerent. The present subjunctive of sum, sim, sis, sit, simul, situs, sint. So sint goes here. The imperfect, present active infinitive plus the personal endings, essem, esses, esset, essemus, essetus, essent. Perfect is fu plus errant, fuerent. And the pluperfect active infinitive, fu plus isse, and then ent, fuissent, fuissent. Participles, there is no present active participle of sum, and it freaked out Cicero and Caesar. Don't worry, we came up with one later. But there isn't one in classical Latin. The perfect active participle doesn't exist. Neither does the present passive participle. We don't really have a perfect passive participle for sum, but we do have a future active participle, and that is futurus. That is futurus. Futurus does not act like the perfect passive participle. Don't put anything here. And there is no gerundive. There is no gerund form for sum. So present active infinitive is esse, there it be. The perfect active is fuisse, like normal, and then the future active is futurus aum esse. Nothing in the passive. The imperative singular is s, es, be, s. Plural is este, este, be ye. Come on, guys, do it. Be, este. Optime, that wasn't so bad. Now let's move on to possum. If you can do sum, you can do possum. Sum is found in possum. If you know sum, add P-O-T in front of the forms of the verb, and you get most of the forms of sum. So P-O-T, P-O-T, and then if the form of sum starts with an S, that T becomes, it assimilates to an S. That's why we have double S. It's pot-sum. Pot-sum. But it's easier to say possum. But for the present tense, sum SS, sumus estus sunt, it's possum, potes, potest, potsumus becomes possumus, potestus, and then potsunt becomes possunt. So you wrote sunt here for sum. Here you're going to write potsunt, which that T becomes an S, possunt, double S, possunt. No passive for possum. Means to be able to. Already has be in it. Possunt. For sum, you wrote errant here. Here you're going to write P-O-T in front of the errant, and you get poterant. Poterant. For the future of sum, you wrote erunt. Erunt. For possum, you're going to write poterunt. Poterunt. All right, now the similarity kind of drops away. For the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect, you have to go to the verb's third principal part, chop off the I. Potu is the verb's perfect stem. So we have potu erunt, potu erant, potu erant. So these look somewhat similar. The perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect has the U. Potu erunt, potu erant, potu erant. It's got the U, as opposed to the imperfect and future that just have P-O-T. For the subjunctive, here you wrote sint. Here you're going to write pot, P-O-T, sint, but that T becomes an S, so it's possint, double S, possint. The imperfect, posse, plus the int, possent, possent. Then perfect stem, potuerent, potuerent, and the pluperfect, potuissent, potuissent. There is a participle, present active participle for possum, and it's the adjective potens, potentis, powerful. It actually means able to. You have the ability. You are able. You can. Potens, potentis. You learned how to decline that in Form 1. There's no present passive, no perfect active participle. Perfect passive participle also doesn't exist, nor does a future active participle, nor does a future passive participle. It only has potens, potentis, the present active. It does have a present and perfect infinitive, though, but only in the active. We have posse right there, and then potu, and then add isse, potuisse. But because it lacks a fourth principal part, there's no way to form the future. There are also no imperatives for possum, so no need to worry about that. Optime, that is the end of Exercise A, Part 2, and the completion of the entirety of Chapter 42's Exercise A, the morphology of the subjunctive mood. That was a review of the entire synopsis of a verb with a focus on the subjunctive. Make sure you review for your next assessment. Optime, valete omnes.